Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about the Wood Elf Legendary Lords in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, talking about them from the very worst to the very best. And at the bottom of the list we start with Orion. Now of course Orion is technically the best Legendary Lord in the game because all of his armies can be maintained with 0 upkeep if you have enough wars going. So there is a significant amount of benefits if you're playing Orion, but if you take that away, and we know Creative Assembly is going to change that, likely very soon with patch 3.0, then Orion is actually the worst Legendary Lord of the Wood Elves, and that's what I'm basing it on. He gets campaign movement range after raising a settlement, that's nice, while the Wild Hunt is active, mind you, not all the time. He gets -10 cooldown for Deep Root teleportation. Okay, decent enough. Speed, melee attack, and charge bonus for him as well. Decent enough benefits, but nothing particularly wonderful. Now, when we're talking about Orion's special skill line or his special lord skills, they're pretty pathetic. 20% weapon strength for cavalry units and charge bonus for cavalry units don't really do a whole lot, because if you're playing the Wood Elves, cavalry is actually the last thing you want to focus on during the course of your campaign. And then on top of that, his special skill line over here, yes, there are some benefits with his javelins, with Hawk's Talon, absolutely, but all the other things, a bit pointless. You want to keep Orion moving, so all this construction time and local recruitment capacity isn't really going to amount to much. An ambush success chance, that's decent enough. Forest spotting plus 5,000, okay. So you can see them from a long distance, and also 25% campaign movement range after raising a settlement. So you can move around the campaign much faster, but as the Wood Elves, you kind of want to play them a bit more passively because you do need to defend the trees, and you're not really playing Scarbrand effectively. Like, you could play Orion as a mini Scarbrand, but it doesn't necessarily fit the Wood Elves very well. He does have a bunch of items, but there's nothing really good when it comes to Orion. He just doesn't have a powerful combat ability. I mean, his army, obviously, like all Wood Elven armies, is going to be strong, but he has the most mediocre, weakest army of all the Wood Elves. The worst focus of the Wood Elves when it comes to a playstyle, and the only thing that's giving him a lot of power at the moment is because you can just abuse the hell out of this upkeep benefit if you're playing a campaign SM. Take that away and Orion is basically worthless in a significant number of ways. And then you have the offices. Now the offices, and this really doesn't fit well with the upkeep benefit he gets, because yes, you can get a lot of money, but at the moment, do you really need money if you're playing an Orion campaign? No, you do not need money if you're playing an Orion campaign. So getting all these income benefits, income from sacking and looting settlements for the offices, is not great. Another thing to mention over here is when it comes to these offices, he can't put ancient treemen in them. He can only put the other types of characters in those kind of offices. So that's one of the limitations you're going to face during a course of a campaign as Orion, because the best lords for your armies are actually the ancient treemen, because you want to get treekin basically as any legendary lord of the Wood Elves, because you want that kind of siege ability that they have. And ancient treemen have 20% fort save and other benefits for that, but you can't put these guys in office. So these offices actually don't suit him at all at the moment in terms of his campaign playstyle that you're going for. So he is powerful, don't get me wrong. All the Wood Elf legendary lords are powerful. None of them are really bad, but Orion just doesn't really have a whole lot going for him, and some of these campaign mechanics contradict themselves. Why put a bunch of offices that give you income from sacking and raising settlements when you'll have a lot of money anyway when you're playing his campaign by just being at war with factions? That's just the ridiculous bit of campaign design when it comes to Orion at the moment. He really needs some changes. He really needs to have some better mechanics and some better effects when it comes to him. Now, at number 3, we have Drycha. Now, Drycha is absolutely ridiculous in terms of her combat ability. She starts with the most powerful army in the entire game, flat out, and she can easily recruit more units to make this army really far more powerful with the malevolent treekin that she does have. So a great deal of power. I'm not diminishing Drycha's combat ability. She has the most powerful army of all the Wood Elven Legendary Lords from the very start of her campaign, and she will easily wipe out any other enemy next to her. However, the reason I would rank her lower than some of the other Wood Elven Legendary Lords is that, one, some of her offices are just really not that great. Upkeep benefits for Dryads and casualty replenishment aren't really that great, and quite a lot of these offices, except this one, the Speaker for the Forgotten, just aren't really that worth it. Well, Speaker for the Lost is decent enough because it gives you another army that has Insidious Glamour for all elf units, but her offices are pretty mediocre. Coadel is great as a Legendary Lord, but so is Ariel, that the other ones have access to. And beyond that, Drycha is actually the most hated of all the Wood Elven Legendary Lords, and she doesn't start with the Oak of Ages, which is actually a more significant problem than you might believe when it comes to winning her campaign. Like, Drycha can have a very good short campaign where you just annihilate every other faction around you with ease, undeniably so, but actually winning the campaign, which requires you to take the Oak of Ages, and then do the rituals, can be something of an annoyance to tackle during the course of the campaign. So there are certainly some significant issues when it comes to playing Drycha's campaign, having to capture the Oak of Ages, having to deal with Orion, having maybe even to deal with these two other Wood Elven factions. You can only confederate Durthu, I believe, and you do need the Oak of Ages to be able to confederate Durthu. So there's certainly issues when it comes to playing this campaign, and that's why I knock it down to rank 3 over here on this list. But certainly the most powerful army, ridiculous levels of benefits from this very start, starting with Amber, which you can also use, which you can use to give you that minus 15% upkeep for Dryads, Treekin, and Treemen, is substantial. Being able to recruit Treekin from tier 2, also very substantial, but just a more limited campaign than the other Wood Elven Legendary Lords, because you can only really get Durthu, whereas the other ones, like if you're playing Orion, you can get Durthu and the Sisters. If you're playing the Sisters, you can get Orion and Durthu as well. So a great deal of power over here. Her army is so ridiculous that for every other Legendary Lord that starts next to her, I basically tell them either bring overwhelming force or run in circles around it, sack the Griffinwood, and then let attrition take its toll. Basically, let Drycha weaken herself fighting Azak, take advantage of that, and that's how you defeat her. If you're playing as, say, Katrin, or Kislev in general, or Vlad. Don't seek a direct confrontation, because it's not going to end well for you. And number 2, we, of course, have Durthu. Now, Durthu may not necessarily have an army as strong as Drycha's, because he doesn't have Malevolent Treekin, so he doesn't have Frenzy on them. That said, he does have his own benefits for all his Treekin and Treemen in melee attack, armor, piercing weapon damage, and base weapon damage. And he also buffs the ranged units in his army with Ancient Treemen. So basically, as Durthu, if you're playing him, what you want to get is a bunch of Ancient Treemen during the course of your campaign, because that's how you're going to gain a lot of power during the course of that particular campaign. He also has the ability of getting Wall Breaker for Ancient Treemen and Treemen units. So his lords and his Treemen can break down the walls of settlements. So Durthu has the best siege army probably in the entire game in a lot of ways when you think about it, because he has Treekin, which are really good at just going up against the gates and breaking them down and killing everything in sight. Then he can break down the walls with lords alone. He doesn't need Shatterstone. He just needs a lord, the Ancient Treeman lord, in order to bust down the walls of settlement. And he can also do this too, if I'm not mistaken. Could be wrong on that, but either way, he has a lot of power when it comes to sieges. He has access to the entire ranged roster of the Wood Elves, so he can get Way Watchers, unlike Drycha. So he has more versatility in his armies, unlike Drycha. And he can also, like Drycha, get Treekin from tier 2 as opposed to tier 3. So a great deal of power. But actually, the biggest amount of power that Durthu has is this fact. He can confederate every other Legendary Lord of the Wood Elves. So he can get the Sisters, he can get Orion, and he can get Drycha as well. So enjoy playing a campaign as Durthu because he is ridiculous. Drycha may have a much better army in quite a few ways, but Durthu is no slouch either. He has much better combat ability, though Drycha wins out with her debuffs. One thing to be said about Durthu, finally, is that he has great offices for his faction. So he has the Ancient over here that gives him 25 growth, which is actually pretty important for the Wood Elves. They don't have commandments, but they do need growth for their economic buildings. So getting a title that gives you 25 growth is actually pretty important for the Wood Elves. Then you have one with control and minus 20% upkeep. All of his offices have minus 20% upkeep, as well as various benefits for the structures in those in those regions. Well, with the exception of this one, which just gives unit experience. But either way, you will have cheaper armies just by default. With like having 5 cheap armies is going to be pretty important. And when I say 5 cheap armies, I mean 5 cheap armies because he has a minus 30% upkeep for Forest Spirit units as well from the very start of his campaign. I mean, as I said, Drycha is more insane in just like sheer combat ability, but Durthu has a much better campaign prospect because he does start with the Oak of Ages, he can confederate all the Legendary Lords, he is an absolute monster in battle, just doesn't have the same kind of debuffs that Drycha has, but he has plenty of buffs as well going for him. So a ridiculous amount of power, pretty good campaign, pretty good office effects, and overall a really strong Legendary Lord. And finally, and number 1, we have the Sisters of Twilight. They're basically a flying artillery piece, like a flying eagle claw bolt thrower. That's how people have defined them on. They start on an eagle, they later on get a dragon for a quest battle. Now imagine a flying dragon with artillery on it, and you can imagine what the Sisters of Twilight can do on their own. There were videos back in Warhammer 2 of people basically making a doom stack with just the Sisters and Ariel and just annihilating everything in their path. Really powerful stuff there. Still, you could argue Durthu and Drycha have better armies, and in a lot of ways they do. Treekin are great units. However, here's the thing. The Sisters still can recruit Treekin. Yes, it's going to take them tier 3. Yes, they're not going to be as good Treekin as Durthu and Drycha can get. They don't have the wall breaker ability. All well and good and valuable points. However, the Sisters do have their own significant benefits in their own campaign. They get 10% ammunition to all armies, which is pretty damn important for a faction like the Wood Elves, which does have a lot of powerful range units. Then, crucially, they get the Volley of Kurnos for Hawk Riders. Now, this has only 1 use by default, but their special skill line gives them 2 usages over here when it comes to the Volley of Kurnos in all armies. Now, this is ridiculous because this thing hits like a truck. It just deletes units, and it's on a flying range unit that isn't necessarily too bad. A bit vulnerable to a range counterfire, but with the Volley of Kurnos, it gets a bit absurd. And that's what the Sisters of Twilight do. They focus on those Hawk Riders. They get the minus 15% upkeep for missile units and melee attack and charge bonus for flying units. So they and their Hawk Riders can actually be pretty decent in melee as well. Unleash the Doom Tide of the Hawk Rider Doom stack on your enemy. Like, basically, the Sisters still have Treekin and Treeman. Not as good, sure. Fair enough. You don't have the individual upgrades that Durthu and Drycha have in terms of armor and all that. So they're going to be weaker. Undeniably so. But they're still Treekin and Treeman. They're still pretty damn powerful when it comes down to it, just by default. And then they have the entire range roster available, of course. And they have that third army option with Hawk Riders, which in itself is pretty strong. Don't have the same kind of siege ability, of course, but then they can just fly Hawk Riders over the walls and kill everything in sight using that. Then looking at their officers, they do have quite a few offices. Campaign movement range for the Queen's Champion. Basically, this is for Orion over here. We all know who this is for. Then we get other offices. Their offices are pretty mediocre, I would have to say. Not really all that great when it comes down to it. Just the campaign movement range is pretty decent, but everything else, I can't say that these offices are great. Replenishment is good, sure, but it's just a spell. that's it. And 10% ward save, undeniably so, but I do vastly prefer Durthu's offices. However, the sisters do have one significant benefit when it comes to their campaign situation. They get the Forge of Dave. One of the things to know about Wood Elven campaigns, unless you're playing Orion, and even as him, you might not necessarily have unlimited armies. Because you don't really need unlimited armies. The Wood Elves are one of those races which can focus heavily on quality over quantity, unless you're playing Orion, in which case you get both quantity and quality. Either way, you get all of these items, and these items are pretty powerful items when it comes to it. So you get either benefits in terms of, like, say, for instance, the Dragon Mask, post-battle loot, income from raising settlements, quite a bit of money over there, or a benefit to combat potential, or like Eagle, ammunition, research, range, ambush chance, Twilight, vigor loss reduction, recruitment cost, control, weapon strength, armor, dreaming, upkeep minus 15%, snipe, stalk, and also the dreaming cloak ability, which summons a unit of Way Watchers. Pretty good stuff when it comes down to it. So lots of good, useful items that you can put on different lords. Then faction-wide benefits through the Forge for a number of turns. So this is all pretty good stuff, and it's the combination of the Forge, the fact they have a third really strong and viable army only available if you're playing them, the fact that they're a flying artillery piece, the fact they do start with the Oak of Ages, and can also confederate both Durthu and Orion in their campaigns. There's a good amount of power when you're playing the Sisters of Twilight, and it basically, until Creative Assembly made the changes to Orion, they were by far and away the best legendary lord for the Wood Elves. Yes, they can't get Drycha, obvious reasons behind that. They don't have the same kind of melee potential, but range potential, they are by far and away the best. Probably the best legendary lord in the entire game when it comes to range potential, actually, because having powerful flying ranged units is a power in and of itself. And having that available faction-wide is ridiculous. Beyond the fact that they have powerful range units on the ground as well, and they have quite a bit of ammunition for those units. So a significant amount of power when it comes to that. More focused on the range playstyle, of course, than the melee playstyle as Durthu and Drycha, but certainly they were the best legendary lord until Durthu's upkeep changes. Realistically, of course, realistically, Orion, with his upkeep situation, is the best legendary lord for the Wood Elves at the moment, but we know that's going to be changed. We know that situation is not going to last. Will be interesting to see if Orion is still going to stay at the bottom of the pile as he was before that, or if he's going to be able to actually be worth playing it, because he's certainly not worth playing if you take his upkeep away at the moment. Compared to the Sisters, the Durthu, and Drycha, he absolutely isn't worth playing. I think he does need to have his own unique campaign that's just better, because like focusing on cavalry units and the current meta of Warhammer 3 just doesn't work all that well. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications.